In my last video, we talked about what happens to the body when you decide to go on a through hike. And, if you're watching this now, you might be thinking, oh yeah, I finished the through hike. My body's a little messed up and I know I probably need to gain weight back. So what do I do? Well, if you look at some online resources, there's things from low glycemic diets to restricting your calories because you're not hiking 20 miles a day. But if you look at the last video that I posted last week, which you should go watch. So what do? Just eat whatever you want without any restrictions? Yeah.
So then in the next 3 months, they had them in a rehab period of refeeding, but it wasn't a full refeeding. It was still kind of restricted and limited. So they were allowed between 2,000 to 3,000 calories. So almost fully refeeding, but still somewhat limited. They were still being controlled, I would say.
Right.
And during those 3 months of refeeding, the obsessive psychology issues continued, sometimes worsened. And then after those 3 months, they had 2 months of unrestricted. So, okay, eat however much you want. And that's where binge eating behavior worsened for most people. And they ate way more than 3,000 calories because they were, again, still in that process of refeeding. And during both the restricted rehab phase and the unrestricted rehab phase, weight did regain. And they gained back all of their weight loss, plus the average guy gained back an extra 10% of their weight loss because they did metabolic testing on the participants, and their resting metabolic rate declined throughout this process.
Like I said before, I actually worked with Lindsey around this time last year. And, I'm very, very grateful for it because this was probably the hardest thing for me to do, was to refeed my body and just not have any restriction at all. Like I said before, I was gluten-free on the entire trail, which I do think was a big contributor to the amount of weight loss that I had. And it was very hard because my body changed so drastically. I came home and my clothes that used to fit me when I was home in society were like too big on me, and it went from that to all the way to the furthest side where I couldn't even put those clothes on. I thought I looked good when I got back home, when if you talk to any of my loved ones, it was not looking great. I had ribs popping out, my hips were popping out. I looked as though that there was like just skin draped over my skeleton. Like, it just overall was not healthy, but in my mind, for some reason, I thought that I looked like the most athletic. So if you are gonna go on this journey, I highly recommend that you have a really good support system. The family that I surrounded myself with, and then having Lindsey and the group of girls that were also going through this at the same time, was invaluable.
I think give yourself full permission right away to refeed. Using the Minnesota starvation experiment as an example, they kept them for 3 more months in only still a controlled refeeding. And I think that just delayed their progress and made the psychological things even worse too. So come home from trail, allow yourself to refeed as quickly as possible. Start that process of your body saying, I have enough energy. Okay. Yes, it might store some of it, but then it's like the quicker your body knows I have enough, I've got more than enough, he or she is not forcing me to hike 20 miles a day anymore. Like everything's under control. Then the sooner things will normalize again. So give yourself that unconditional permission. And it's a little scary sometimes because you might be so hungry, you might be eating more than you did before you left.
Yeah.
But if you give yourself that full permission, the time frame of that should be shorter versus if you try to control it. Because going back to the aesthetic comment, at least for the women, if the women are like, oh, but I like how I look, I don't want to lose this progress, then they don't give themselves full permission, then they don't fully heal, then their metabolism stays disrupted and slower longer, and that just hurts them more in the long run versus just give yourself a month or two of a full refeeding, and then 2 months later, and don't hold me to that number, but approximately a few months later, things will start to feel a lot more normal. if there are, I think I'll speak to the psychological side. If there are any weird behaviors around food that continue on longer, if you do feel like you're engaging in binge eating longer than 3 months post trail, then, I would seek help for that.
It took about 4 months for my hunger to finally stabilize. And then it took an additional 4 months for me to finally cap out on weight. Like I said, I gained about 15% prior to what I was before. So, yeah. But again, everybody is different. And my body, I think, also was screwed up even before I even hiked the Appalachian Trail. So what about future through hikes? What if you're about to go hike the Appalachian Trail and you want to avoid this as much as possible?
And you mentioned this earlier too, about people like planning their food out, but it's still just so hard to get enough in. And that's absolutely right. It's just hard when you're carrying as much as you are and moving as much as you are on the terrain that you are. It is hard to get enough in. So you do want to plan as much as possible, but with that planning it's like, plan for more. People don't know how much their bodies need, especially in today's culture. I'm going to reference 1944 again. They thought it was normal for a man to eat 3,200 calories a day. And I think that's normal as a dietitian, but like, there are so many people today that think 2,000 calories is the average, appropriate amount to eat. And then women have this notion that it's even less than that. And it's like, wait a second. One, are you an average person? Two, you're doing a through hike. So like, you need to prepare for thousands of calories more, thousands more, and I think that's where some people, even if you're planning a lot, you might still be planning with the false notion of like 3,000 calories is a lot, 4,000 calories is a lot. And it's like, no, like 15,000 calories is a lot.
Right.
And so, yeah, I just think plan with that, as far as like, the more that you can fuel as you're going, then when you do stop in town and eat a meal, I want to say take advantage of that meal. But yeah, we don't want you to feel sick to your stomach or have long-term effects of that either, both physically or psychologically. So it's just one of those things that the more you can keep up with it during making really, really nutrient dense meals, and as all hikers know, nuts and nut butters and dried fruit are some of our best sources of that. Maybe some powders can be really helpful too, and not just protein powder, like actual nutritional powders that have carbs, proteins, fats that you can mix into your meals. Would be advised to just constantly keep up with it as much as you can.
For any type of future through hikes that I may or may not be doing, I am going to make sure that I do a pretty good bit of planning than what I did prior. I'm not going to be gluten-free because I really don't need to. And we'll get to that if you are in that position. But I am going to make sure that I utilize things like protein powders, green powders, carbohydrate powders, making sure that I look up recipes online and maybe even potentially dehydrating them and bringing them out there. I'm also going to make sure that I am not focusing so much on my hunger cues and probably focusing more on the fact of, hey, I need to make sure that I am fueling for the amount of, energy that I just put out there, because the next day I have to get up and hike again.
One thing to remember is that your hunger cues are hormones as well. So as I mentioned, as you go through starvation and hormones get suppressed, your hunger and fullness cues get suppressed as well. So that's one reason why you don't feel hungry. So you don't want to eat, because you're not getting your hunger cue. But then when you do eat, you don't feel full. So you overeat because you're not getting your fullness cues. So your hunger and fullness cues are not quite reliable. So kind of sticking to a fueling schedule, mapping it out, and maybe even working with a dietitian, a sports dietitian, or even if there's somebody who has been on a through hike themselves who really know this, because your average dietitian, I don't think, would understand the amount of calories that are needed on something like this.
The other thing is to also eat as much as you can on trail. One thing that I am going to incorporate and have been incorporating it to my daily hikes is making sure I have something in my mouth, like taking a bite of something every 30 to 45 minutes. This is a technique that a lot of long distance endurance athletes have, triathletes, long distance runners. Every single 30 to 45 minutes, they take a bite of something. This is so that they don't bonk their race or training session. So this will be pretty helpful for you when you're out hiking the trail.
For the women too, you mentioned like the difficulties of the period. I'll say this as well, like, if you do lose your cycle, and for the men too, like if you do think you're having hormonal imbalances, obviously it's not healthy. You want to do your best to mitigate it and prevent it. But if it does happen, just work on healing yourself when you come back. For the women specifically, it's when you're missing a cycle, anything more than 3 months in a row is when we start to get concerned. And then once we've been missing it for 6 months or a year, that's where, okay, bone health can be really impacted. And then longer than that, we do have questionable, like, is this affecting our ability for childbearing in the future? Even if it's not something you care about at the moment, it's in the future. And so, I would say if it does go missing, there's no need to freak out. Same thing with the men. You're starting to think your hormones are out of whack. Like, we don't need to freak out. We just want to do our best to mitigate it and work on that recovery as soon as possible when you come back.
If you also realize that you are noticing some disordered eating habits, or you're having a really hard time refeeding yourself after coming back home from trail, or just in general, you want to plan accordingly what is going to be good for you for your through hike, I'll leave some links in the description below.
What's the biggest piece of advice that you would give, especially because there are a lot of people that are going to have a lot of body dysmorphia when they get back home?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just remembering, to be proud of what you accomplished and why you accomplished it.
Mm-hmm.
Most likely you didn't do it in order to change your body.
Mm-hmm.
If your sole motivation is to change your body, there's other ways to do it, probably more effective ways. And I think I would just say, to let that go, to come back to your reasons. Why did you do this? It wasn't about how you looked in the first place. So like, you got to let go of that now too.
If you want to follow Lindsey, she is on Instagram and she has a podcast called the Female Athlete Nutrition Podcast. Even if you're not a female, she has some pretty cool guests on there, and it's loads with rich information that is worth a listen. I highly recommend it. I'll put all of her information in the description below. If you liked this video or this type of content, feel free to hit that subscribe button, maybe the bell. I'm also on Instagram and TikTok, so I'll leave those links in the description below as well. And I will see you guys in the next one.